Yeah. So, Katie, you want to start with introducing?
Yes, so hello everyone to those in the room and those online. We're really excited to get together with all of you and talk about this topic. And I'm Katie McNeil, and I'm one of the co-chairs along with those in the front of the room, and we'll introduce ourselves in a moment. And we are a few logistics. So I've sort of put in the chat, and there's a link here to the collaborative notes document. And whether you're joining online or in the room, please add yourself to the attendance list. We want to keep in touch. And also, it is a shared notes document, so feel free to put in your notes there. So we are recording, you all have seen that. And then we're going to be doing our best to sort of run things either in a unified way or in parallel in the room and online. So when you heard Brigitte say a moment ago about their sort of post-it notes in the room for activities, we'll also have any activities that we're doing in the room, we'll have an online form as well. And so those of you who are sort of in the room, you'll raise your hand at any point when you have a question or a comment. We'll see the same thing online, and I will be monitoring the chat there. And so to start, for those of you who are joining online, please introduce yourself in the Zoom chat, where you work and what your role is, or if you're sort of between roles, what your interests are, your interest in data granularity, and a random fun question: what color socks are you wearing? So those are a few logistics, and again, the slides will be shared online afterwards. So any other logistics from in the room we should take care of before we move on?
Right. Nope, I think we're well practiced.
Next slide, please.
Okay.
Oh, that's happening.
That's happening. Okay. Okay, here we go.
Thank you. So why don't I have, I'll introduce myself and then hand off to my other co-chairs to do this themselves. So my name is Katie McNeil, and I'm dialing in at the moment from the East Coast of the United States, but I'm there in spirit with you all in person. And at the moment, I'm between jobs, but I've worked in research data in academia, national archives, and scholarly societies, and I'm really excited to be with you all. So Raina, we'll go in order. I'll pass it off to you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Raina Jenkins. I'm a data storage and manager at Ocean Networks Canada, where I've been 14 years doing ocean data curation and data management. So, but really interested in this topic of data granularity as I was trying to figure out our own infrastructure challenges. And so that's why I got involved here. And hopefully this topic of conversation resonates with all of you. So.
Yeah, so I'm Brigitte Matiak. I'm from Germany at GISIS, as you can see here. And I come from data discovery angle, and their granularity is also very important, so we can know what kind of entities are actually the ones that people are looking for. And yeah, that's my perspective on data granularity. Okay, I'll switch to
Excellent.
Next slide.
Yes, so here's what we have set for you all for the day. Just after this introduction, we're going to be talking about the process of our working group. We're sort of nearing conclusion. So we'll be talking about the process that we went through and the method for doing our work in 3 different focused areas, subgroups that we had on a survey, development of use cases, and evaluation of constraints. Then we'll present sort of the results of those methods, so the use cases and the main recommendations from our guidance paper. And then we'll have a really ample chunk of time for interactive activities. We'll have a session where we'll have physical post-it notes and boards in the room and a Jamboard online, which is sort of if you haven't used it before, it's a software that's as if you're sticking a post-it note up onto a big board. And we're going to be interested in getting your thoughts and feedbacks on what we've presented, and then talk about next steps.
And adoption.
Ready? Yes, yes. Oh, that's right. Yes. And the final thing is just to get your ideas on how we might adopt these and how you all and everyone else in the room might adopt them. Thank you. All right. Yes. So, what is data granularity? When we talk about this, just a sort of very brief mention. It's thinking about the level of specificity that's represented in a data set. And we'll talk later about some concepts, but if you think about, you could have a very large amount, such as a collection, down to a data set, down to a particular variable, and sometimes those are referred to levels of granularity. And that oftentimes they are built around specific levels of aggregation for all aspects of the life cycle. We've realized that data granularity touches on data collection and archiving and discovery and access and sharing citation, and that it really affects all of the different parts of the data life cycle, and that to the extent that we as a community can be thinking deliberately about this, that it would help all stakeholders in the community to be able to use sort of common terminology to talk about these levels of granularity and think about how we can best serve researchers from all of these different angles. So really, as I said a moment ago, it touches on data discovery, metadata access, interoperability, analysis, citation, and more. And one of the reasons why I think many of the people involved in the working group may be involved in sort of one of these aspects more than others, but data granularity really touches on almost everything, which is what's one of the things that's exciting about it. Next slide. So our history, so we came out of the data discovery paradigms interest group, and that group, as you can imagine, has an interest in thinking about, well, data granularity from a discovery aspect. When someone is looking for either a large aspect of something or a very, very specific data point or a variable, how does that relate to the aspect of discovery, and how should you enable discovery at different levels of granularity? So it grew out of that interest group and became its own working group. And our mission has been to really explore what are the key questions around this and be able to document what are the issues that data professionals should be thinking about to determine the level of granularity they want to use for user discovery, access, interoperability, citability, and other things. And because data granularity really connects through all the different aspects of what RDA does, we were really determined and still are in working with you all to build upon and complement the existing and ongoing work of the RDA, working in interest groups and special initiatives. There's no need to reinvent the wheel or redo work that's done. So a lot of what we've found has been in reviewing other groups' works and output. And we're really excited to be engaging with all of you at this stage to hear your views on this, because it relates to all the things that you're thinking about, whether you're part of a formal group or not. And our mission, our final deliverables, which we have drafts of, is a set of collected use cases and a guidance document that talks about what are the example use cases, how to prioritize them, what are standard questions about data granularity terminology that we can settle, what is some common terminology we can use as a field, and then recommendations for how different stakeholders in the field, such as data repositories and more, can be thinking about data granularity and how to serve that in their organization. And now, any other sort of points of introduction my co-chairs want to chime in on? Otherwise, we will transition to Brigitte presenting the methodology for the survey.
Yeah, so we made a survey because we wanted to know what the current practices of data granularity are in all kinds of repositories. So we partnered up with Re3 Data and sent out a survey that we designed, and we received 48 replies. For the demographic, we were kind of like, okay, so what does it say about the demographics? So when we look at it, like from a common sense point of view, it would seem that there were a lot of answers from really big repositories and not so many answers from really small repositories, but there's not like a standard demographic that we can compare it to, so there's no real statistic on this. What we can also say from this is that when we ask people like what is the lived practice of granularity, one of the things that's maybe not that surprising is that a data set is a package of multiple files, usually including documentation or code for further analysis. I also saw some of the answers from this survey. So this is what we found here. A lot of the repositories are global in scope, but well, we have all kinds of answers here. Then we have a lot of interdisciplinary data services, but also more specialized ones. So there's a good mixture here. And also this one where we basically say, okay, what granularity are you talking about? These are the answers for an entity that they would call a data set. And that would be that it's a package of multiple files, but there's all kinds of other answers as well. So this is one of those questions where people would be able to tick multiple boxes. We can see, like, for example, it includes code, includes documentation, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so that's that. And the other question that we were particularly interested in, and this is all very condensed because only 5 minutes. The other things that we were interested in with this survey was like, what kind of gatekeeping do you use? Do you have guidance documents? Do you have guidelines on how to, on what kind of granularity you want? And there were very diverse set of answers. Some people say, like, we choose what kind of granularity comes into our repository. Other people say, okay, there are guidelines and we enforce the guidelines. Then there are guidelines, but we don't enforce these guidelines. Then there is the answer, like, okay, people are expected to follow the community examples, and the most laissez-faire one is, okay, people just give us whatever they want and we keep it as. So, and again, there's no real trend, like we have a full spectrum of all these answers. When we correlate that with a couple of other metrics that we looked into, was that we also asked people, like, what is the heterogeneity of your repository? And unsurprisingly, that the people that enforce it more also have more homogeneity. Like, if you say, okay, we only take granularity level like this, then usually you would also have less well, you know what I mean, like the more you enforce it, the more homogeneous your repository is. But what I find a little surprising is that it's only weakly correlated to how happy people are with their rules. Like, I have a lot of write-in answers where people go like, okay, so we don't have rules and we're perfectly happy with that. Or we don't have rules and enforcing them would, it would be too much work. We have other priorities. So there is no strict correlation between having strict rules for granularity and being completely happy and having, like, the perfect repository. There are multiple different ways that strategies that people use to deal with this issue, and for some people it seems to work, and for other people it doesn't seem to work. We also asked them, what are the challenges in your domain with regards to granularity? And the number one thing that most people are concerned with is discovery. That seems quite challenging. And the second most one is citation. Both citation problems, either too specific or too unspecific. And then there were, of course, also some concerns concerning reproducibility and duplication. We did have a couple of more answers and some write-ins, as you can see here, but none of those were particularly popular as a challenge. Okay, so to conclude, what are the findings? So we have a wide variety of granularity strategies, and they all have certain trade-offs. We have this correlation, but it's probably not suitable for everyone. It's expensive, and especially with multidisciplinary repositories, I can't really see how that's even feasible. Granularity is seen as the number one problem when it comes to granularity, and this is also not really correlated to who you're asking. So we have one repository that only has 8 research objects in the repository in total, and they still feel that discoverability is the main issue with granularity. There were some very, very interesting writing answers. So I read all of them, and it was really inspiring. So if you were one of the people who answered the survey, thank you very much. It was pointed out that discovery not only hinges on granularity per se, but on the quality of documentation at the chosen granularity level. This is certainly true. And also that a strict enforcement of granularity rules doesn't translate into multidisciplinary repositories once the metadata gets harvested. And that's also certainly true that even if you and your repository have like very strict and maybe domain specific rules on how you handle things, the second you get harvested to something bigger, it gets mixed up with other stuff, and then that's the advantages of the homogeneity actually get lost. Yes, and that's from me, and I think use cases are next. I think Katie does that.
Well, and I'm just thinking that we're actually ahead of time, so
yeah.
we could take a pause and see if anybody has any questions about what you've
We're not.
presented.
No, we are 2 minutes ahead. Oh, we're not. We're 3 minutes after time.
Oh, are we? Okay, sorry, I miscalculated. Okay, all right, I'll jump in. So, as we had said, to do our work, we split up into, and maybe I didn't actually articulate this well enough before, split it up into 3 subgroups to carve out different activities. So there was the survey of the repositories. Raina will talk in a moment about their work. And we had a subgroup that worked on developing these use cases. And we had people from across different countries and sectors and settings. Really grateful for the great group of people that we had working on this. And we had been inspired to say that we were going to create, not only describe use cases in the recommendations document, but actually create a separate set of use cases, because I think the RDA community has found in different settings that those are really helpful for adoption, for thinking about specific settings in which the issue, in this case, granularity, would come about in different aspects in different settings. So that was the reason to pull out use cases separately. And as I said, we had a composition of people in the subgroup from academia, publishing, repositories, data collectors, and more. So it was a great set of perspectives. And the first step that we took is to agree on the format that the use cases would take, because many people many of you in the room and online have probably seen that when people say use cases, they sometimes mean different things. They sometimes mean something very specific and structured, more open-ended description. So we reviewed various different aspects and strategies for formatting the use cases. And we ended up deciding on a hybrid of narrative descriptions, being able to just sort of write out the setting or scenario of the use case that you're talking about, and then also have, when possible, what is sometimes known as the user story format, which takes the form of the sentence: as a person in a certain role, I have a certain goal so that I can achieve a certain result. So over many different meetings, we decided to sort of zero in on this format to be able to both have that structured format for describing the use case, as well as having a narrative, because sometimes the situation regarding granularity doesn't fit into that formula. So we wanted to be able to have the hybrid of both. And I think another thing that I'll say is, in terms of all of our meetings to decide on the format, one of the things that kept coming up, and this is sort of a meta comment, is what should be the granularity of the use cases that we write up. So granularity even sort of arose as an issue as we were figuring out our own work. So I thought that that was interesting. All right, next slide, please. So what we ended up doing is then, and you'll see Graham, who's in the room, will be presenting before what we created. But what we ended up deciding as part of this format of both the structured and the narrative is that we had came up with a content of the structured format that has certain fields that describe the use case, that describe different aspects of terminology. And then we settled on several different controlled fields to describe the use cases and certain structured aspects regarding the role of the stakeholder, the level of granularity, and that gets to the question of terminology we're going to talk about. When people say data set or variable, what do they mean by that? And then the category or type of use case, and this relates to to some extent, the phase of the data lifecycle that we're talking about, is this a granularity issue having to do with data collection or discovery or citation, or in often cases, it actually will relate to many of those. And so we settled on a format that we felt like would serve the vast majority of use cases. And as for where we got the information for the use cases, as I mentioned before, we really worked to leverage what had already been done in the RDA. So we went through lists of RDA outputs and pulled out the ones that had information and recommendations regarding granularity. We pulled those out of those. We also pulled it from our own experience working in different sectors. And the one thing that I will say is that the granular information we pulled together is firmly what we're calling a convenience sample. It's what happens to have been mentioned in RDA documents. It's what we happen to have found ourselves, but it may not be an exhaustive list because there may be perspectives that just haven't been explored yet. So we welcome your thoughts on that. And we had a shared spreadsheet document that we were working with that we contributed to, would give each other feedback on, and then reviewed it and structured it in a way so it can be used by end users. And you'll see a view of that later. And now I'll pass it off to Raina.
Okay, so in terms of constraints, we kind of wanted to take into account what's already out there in the community so that we don't bump into tight corners. So one aspect of constraints we looked at is existing schemas and registries that are out there, like what fields of metadata that they have and how does granularity get represented. And we're using this term dimensions to represent the ways that maybe you would describe your data sets or your collections or subsets in terms of the boundaries of what made you choose that set of files or that set of data points or that whatever to be your entity. So we're using this word dimensions, although we're kind of looking for a better word because it makes sense to talk about a dimension when you're talking about time and space, but the ways you might do this are also more thematic or by project or just even the types of files. So we're looking for maybe a better word. We also were looking, so we were looking for how do existing schemas represent those kinds of items? And then also how do they speak to the notions of things like collections and subsetting within the metadata schemas or registries? What kind of fields do they have? How do they allow these relationships to be represented? Things like that. And even though there are findings like not necessarily these properties all being adequately represented in all these and sometimes conflicting, we're not treating these as really tight constraints. Possibly we can use the outcomes of what we do here to recommend those schemas go through a versioning and maybe get a little bit of finesse through their governance structure. So, we're not totally boxed in necessarily. And then, so just one example, one that most people are familiar with, DataCite. So just looking like some of the findings there, temporal, they do have option for a date type when you're talking about what period does the data cover. In terms of time range, there's also date information. It's free text though, so it's not very kind of specific on how you show that information. So that's difficult for, say, machine readability or harvesters to really utilize that very well. And there's no information about the resolution necessarily or how regular is that data. Same with geography. You do have latitude, longitude capabilities. You can do it by point, box, or polygon, which is pretty typical. Or description, but as someone coming from oceanography, there's no depth field. So in environmental data, depth and altitude can be pretty important criteria for discovery and other factors. Thematic, they do have the subject, which gives option of they have the classification codes. So that's there. They do have the notion of a resource type of collection as well as obviously data set. They are using these related identifiers, right, to say is part of or has part. So that information is there. In terms of subsetting information, they don't have a specific resource type for subset, which is fine, but they do have kind of a little bit maybe on ways that subsetting might occur in terms of formats and sizes available, but again, free text, so that can be highly varying, and there's maybe other types of dimension type fields that they should have and that they don't necessarily. We also, in terms of constraints, looked at what other RDA working group outputs are there already, so we don't A, reinvent the wheel, but B, that we don't necessarily conflict with what they've already said. So we looked through all of these, looking for ways of validating what we're doing, any concerns that they had around granularity that we should be considering, or even any good ways forward. So yeah, we just didn't want to have conflict, and we wanted to build upon what's been done. There are, in maybe a couple of cases, some things that maybe we might end up conflicting with. In those cases, we want to just make sure that we would provide that rationale, that's clear that we really thought about it if we are conflicting. But there was quite a lot of validation for what we're doing when you read through these outputs. Like, they oftentimes will recognize the need for better consistency of thinking about granularity, even just the terminology used, and how granularity is applied. So there's definitely a need to kind of come to terms within the wider community on these topics. Just a few examples extracted for some of the outputs. There's many working groups that touch on this granularity concept, but just a few here. So data citation working group is a really obvious one, where they developed recommendations for really precise machine actionable ways of identifying the data in subsets that was used. And they also do account for versioning and having PIDs or identifiers for those subset information, and as well as metadata about the subset query itself. In the publishing data services working group, they look at it in the ways that they indicated about collections, was that that collection scope or the contents in it might evolve over time. Like, you might create your collection and then add more content in as time proceeds, and that should be fine. But they had this notion of that's okay as long as you say when you added something, and what's this, that it has to have a source and a PID associated with that, what's included. So so that was already there as guidance. And then another example is the data versioning working group, where they have this principle 3, which talks about making sure that you're identifying and versioning your collections properly, and that you and they talk about determine the granularity is to be determined by the use case to provide ways of identifying parts and versions wherever the practical needs arises. So again, that concept comes up, and so we're just kind of building on what's been done already in some ways. So I guess it's you here.
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Graham Smith at Spring Nature, and I'm going to attempt the very risky live demo of something outside of the slides, so just bear with me. Aha, first obstacle overcome. So this is the use cases document that Katie referred to previously. So this is really...
Excuse me, I'm Graham. I'm just going to jump in that we can't see it online.
Ah, okay.
I can see the slides, but not the...
I think maybe the share is for...
Oh, you stop share and then you share.
Okay.
So it's not the screen, it's the...
Yeah.
So stop share and then share again.
Yeah.
You can just push on it.
Or that.
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
And what I'll just say while you're doing that is what Graham is showing is linked from the slides that will be shared. All right, success. I see an Excel file.
Right. Well, like I said, it's the live demo. It can go worse than that, believe me. I have experienced that. So the use cases that we put together, this really complements the recommendations as an output. So this is a document that's intended to be really something that could be utilized by anyone who's exploring this concept of data granularity. And so the first tab is really the instructions for a user who's actually coming to this document, and if they want to explore the particular use cases that we've actually compiled. Within the use case list, this is where all the use cases are documented in this more structured way. So we can see, for example, from which roles perspective the use case actually takes place. Is it, for example, a repository? Is it a producer of data, consumer of data? What were the motivations? What is the person trying to do? So you can see it follows almost like a narrative structure, but in this very structured set of fields, also defining the level of granularity and the user problems that we actually identified from this. So did this expose a particular challenge, for example, for this user? Now, as Katie mentioned, we also related these to more of a free-form narrative. So the idea for this, and apologies, that's actually not showing up well, but so the narrative might give you the overall story. So, for example, a particular researcher in a particular area, what they're trying to achieve. And from that narrative, there may be a number of different use cases. We also have a tab with the concept definitions in there. So I mentioned things like the roles. So who's the data producer, data consumer, data subject in this case, or repository, as well as a number of other roles, such as publisher, data manager. And it also documents the other things like level of granularity and the type of use case. So really, what's the problem it involves? Is it something around accessing data, finding data, citability or usage metrics? So, for example, if as a publisher, I was coming to this and I really wanted to look at how do our data citation guidelines for researchers currently cover the concept of data granularity? Is there some kind of use case which we're actually missing here? You could simply just look for the category of use case, filter based on citability usage metrics. And then I can see, for example, a number of different use cases which have been laid out from different perspectives that relate to this concept of citability. And if I was to take, for example, citability from the perspective of a data producer, so that could be an author who's actually wanting to cite the data that they've actually produced. And we can see where that relates to, sorry, getting the wrong way there. That relates to narrative number 5. So what we might want to do is go away and look for more information about that. Where was it sourced from? And the narrative might be actually outlined here as something that we've just experienced, or it might be that the narrative was derived, in this case, from one of the other working groups' outputs. So we can see in this case that came from the data versioning working group. Okay, I might just put the share back on the slides. Yeah. Slides back. Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Next up, that's Raina again.
Okay. Right, so obviously the goal here is to take all these ways of looking at things and produce some sort of guidance. And so that's what we're nearing kind of completion on in terms of what we have a draft, and then it'll be going out to the community. So as far as an outline, it's, you know, this is basically our outline where we have an executive summary, go through some of the terminology that we're using here. What is the methodology that you have a sneak peek on, and the findings? What are the general trends and observations that we're seeing that kind of span the 3 different approaches? And then what are our actual recommendations and conclusions? So I'm just gonna go through a little bit of that. So here we have sort of a little mock-up of sort of conceptualizing these notions of subset, data set, and collections, just to illustrate some of the kind of properties that we're thinking. So So one important thing is data sets can belong to more than one collection. They're not constrained that a data set must only exist in one collection. And of course, other research objects, whether it's like representation of a physical sample or code or other kinds of research objects that have their own PIDs, they can also be part of these collections alongside the data sets. And then subsets over here of a data set, they can independently also be part of a collection, really noting the specific subset of a data set. One thing we're also saying is that a license that's applied to a data set also should hold true for the subset, and that the contributing parties involved in a data set also get associated to that subset. So that's sort of some of the kind of properties or relationships that we're conceiving in what we're talking about. So then if we look, just to look at that in kind of some words and go a little bit deeper, when we're talking about these dimensions or boundaries, it's really important that metadata describes these boundaries or dimensions, the ways you can slice and dice the data sets. It's not so much a description of the data set, so much as ways that you can segment and pull apart the data set into subsets, so that that information can be easily understood. We'll explain them more in the following recommendations. But yeah, data sets might contain different files or databases, and that there's a group of authors, being individuals and organizations. Author is a kind of a weird word, but any kind of contributors, and then there's that license. And yeah, so this basically reiterates what's on the previous illustration. But what you can see there, of course, is that we have that notion that research objects in a collection can change over time, as long as there's a trail with time stamping of when those changes occurred. And yeah, so all the other points are kind of just reiterated of what's in that visual. So I'm gonna, as we get into the activity, this information gets repeated on the piece of paper. So everything that's in this definitions is on the first paper. So we'll come back to that there. In terms of our specific recommendations, we kind of broke this up into 4 categories of recommendations. So the first is around metadata schemas and the content. So point A being that it's really important to document the granularity type. So by that I mean, is it a collection, data set, or a subset? And also to represent what is the relationships between them in the metadata within the scheme. And each of these points, sometimes you see brackets at the end, and that just gives some indication about where it came from in our different evaluation method approaches that we took. Not all of them are filled out that way though yet. And then it's really important that these dimensions, or the ways you can structurally break down your data set, are really clear, consistent, comprehensive, and interoperable. One thing I want to say here is that I think the majority of us, when we entered this working group, we thought we would come out of at the end with like, you must define your boundaries of data set in this particular way. And it must be something like this. And we realized that's really not feasible or possible or even desirable. But what's really important is to know how you can pull things apart and in different ways, and that you really clearly interoperably represent that. So that's what we really need to work towards, is like, what are these dimensions? How do we describe their units, their measure or their resolution in an interoperable way? So that's, I think, really one of the most important things that we're kind of moving towards. In terms of policy, there needs to be, kind of enforcement around this. So we were saying that the ways of handling granularity must be documented in data policies and guidance wherever possible. This is both for repositories and things like journal publishers. So basically any stakeholder type that's dealing with granularity should mention it. And then also that it is still advisable, even if not necessary to try and have some consistent notions of these dimensions and segmentations, say within a repository or discipline. And that just really helps in your ability to set consistent, defined workflows, ways of doing things through deposit all the way to distribution within your repository or field. And that even just internally you can have better metrics, but it's not necessary that across domains or across repositories that you necessarily do it the same way. In terms of discovery and access, by having those metadata around the dimensions, then you can leverage that, whether it's in your own repository distribution services or by the harvesters who now have the ability to get that information. You can leverage that information for filtering and sorting, and that you try and use the richest metadata that you can in the discovery to aid the people that are looking for the data in the different ways that they would like to. It's also really important that when you're allowing for subsetting, that you maintain that information in the notion of a query store, which comes out of the RDA data citations working group. So you maintain that information, and that basically should include all the dimensions by which the data was sliced and diced into that subset. In terms of citation, it's also very important that every single one of these granularity levels is independently citable with a persistent identifier and having a resolvable landing page with those dimension metadata. And this comes out of a number of sources. And then if you are citing a collection, we really think it's important that that counts as a citation to all the components within, down to the specific data sets. And this has come out of a number of conversations, but it's not the case today. So if someone cites a collection, it doesn't end up showing a citation on the data sets within currently. So that's something that we do really think is important to change. And then it's also very important that users who are finding the data have the ability themselves to customize, like select their own subsets and define their own collections. And there's a number of working groups that are also saying the same thing there. So now we're going to kind of go into an exercise. We have an in-person and virtual equivalent. And so in person, you can see around the room, we have these 5 pieces of paper. And so one is around definitions and the other 4 are those sort of 4 categories of recommendations. And so our idea was that in the box and in that little jar, there's pens and there's Post-its up here that you can kind of write your ideas, like whether you disagree or agree, or I want to add to or take away from something that we've have on that topic there, or if you're confused by anything, just write it and put it there. And we have the same exercise, very similar on the Jamboard. I don't know if Katie, you want to explain the Jamboard one?
I can. And also we have a question that came in with the chat. Do you want to take those? Do we want to sort of take any of those now or just defer them till later?
What's the question?
Yeah, what's the question?
Oh, yes. So the question is, and I'll take a first crack at it, is do you consider it within your remit? So for our working group, or do we have any plans for guidelines, best practices, or frameworks for data creators or people advising data creators? And I'll say that has not been as much of the forefront in our minds as infrastructure providers like repositories, but the idea is for a data creator, this is what you should be thinking about for your levels of granularity. But I think that's an interesting idea. And do you have any thoughts on that? And are there any thoughts in the room?
Well, yeah, I have thoughts. Yeah, that's certainly interesting. But I also think that we're trying to start somewhere here. So this is like, I think the first activity in this direction, really, and we're trying to pioneer something here. So for now, we're really focusing on repositories and other, like organizing people like the publishers. And but I think that going to the data creators is definitely something that we should then do next. Yes.
Okay.
And may I actually briefly just take over screen sharing and give the group a tour of the Jamboard?
Oh, sure.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so there's a question in the audience.
Is there a link to the Jamboard? I don't see it in the share.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, you could participate in the Jamboard. We didn't put in the share notes because it mainly meant for the virtual people, and then we thought that in the room you could physically go, but
Yeah.
Do they have a link?
but we could put a link in
No,
the,
there's a link here.
there's a
Like,
link there, but I don't know if he has access to that, so.
do you have the slides?
I don't have the slides. I just have the Zoom up.
Ah,
Okay, so I just put the link to the Jamboard in the Zoom chat, and I trust everybody can see my screen.
Can you see that in the Zoom chat? You're not in the Zoom, no.
Yeah, I am in Zoom.
Oh,
You
okay.
can- You can see it, but I must have joined after it was listed.
Oh, if you put it in the chat
Slides.
again.
Okay, so just briefly, so again, this is this parallel process that we're going to do both online and
It's not showing on ours.
oh, is it not?
Oh, it's just that little thing, I get it.
yeah, we have to.
Well, I guess it, how do I do that?
Can any of the online people just tell me if you can see a Jamboard that has the word definitions at the top and has different
Yeah, I
color
can see it.
post-it notes?
Yeah, I can see it online.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent. Okay, so this idea is going to sort of replicate walking around the room and putting sticky notes. So we have a sheet, or what's called a frame in Jamboard, for clusters of things we've talked about. So for the definitions and then the recommendations, and I'll go through each of them. And we welcome your thoughts, questions, suggestions on any of these. If you wanted to, you could use this sort of color coding mechanism we came up with. Just any kind of comment you can put in yellow, a version of sort of the plus delta exercise. So a plus you could put in blue, like what you think is good about it. Delta, or in pink, what do you think as a change we should make? And then sort of a brand new idea could be in green. So we have that format for both the definitions, for all the things that Raina went through, so the definitions. Then we have a separate frame. If you just click on the arrow in the top, you'll get back and forth on them. For the recommendations in the several different categories. So metadata schemas and content, policy recommendations, discovery and access recommendations, and citation. And I'll put again a note of a link to the slides. You can refer to those yourself if you want to. And then towards the last one that we have is the idea of adoption ideas. So as you're thinking about your own work or other sectors that you know about, what are some ideas that you think on how these recommendations could be adopted, or how the use cases could be? So there's actually not a seventh frame, how the use cases could be used. So that's a bit of the tour of the Jamboard. And if you haven't used it before, you just sort of, you either have a highlighter, or you could click on sticky note, and I'm typing something in here. And if it's a new idea, I can say, oh, I want to change the note to green. And that's how you create one online. And if we cancel, it looks like it created mine here. So I'll stop there, and I'm just going to monitor the chat and see questions.
Okay, so we do the same thing here. Everybody
You
get
don't
up.
have to stick to the colored.
Yeah, you don't have to stick to the colors. That's too complicated. Just get up and grab
some
a pen
Post-it
and
pen.
some.
Whole box of pen.
Yes. You want to continue reading your emails when we stand up anyway and let the other people out of the room? I guess what how much time do we have with it? Just as.
There's about 20 minutes for this.
Yes, I think that. Thank you very much. Every color, just go ahead, keep it please with that. And. You go.
Oh,
I just one. No, it's okay. Just go around, and if you have any comment, go ahead.
It's like everyone's looking at an art gallery, but taking the pictures.
Yeah. It's like, hmm. Yeah.
We'll go around.
So if you need more of the sticky notes, you can always just break them up and mention. Oops.
I was just trying to. If you have any questions while we're.
Yeah, that's like a please. You're allowed to do, please.
Yeah.
Never seen that except in Zoom.
Yes.
It's.
Yeah, this is right.
I think it's. Election.
Yeah, ground.
Just put a post it. Yes.
And also sometimes when you know, like, you just send what you around and then.
It was a meeting.
Yeah.
As well, but she's always letting that go.
Yeah, yeah.
That's.
Having a, yeah, just having a mix. It was wonderful. Great. But it was like. I was, I don't remember, I had, there, so I was in the parking lot, I didn't try to building, still there. It's like, it's kind of noisy.
Yeah.
It's just hella reversing nearer and nearer as well.
Right. But I mean, I think that's still preferable being a lot of breakers and to the people that people our job staff.
Yeah.
5 people.
First, like, not really.
I didn't realize that when a person gets to a certain level.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to get back on. This is that they're like waving it out the window.
It's better than.
You need pens, you know, you're on the road.
Yeah, yeah. We have plenty of parents. We're.
If they could have, or they come in. Layer, you know, can be.
But that's very nice. The nice thing that. Yeah, I mean, because like even if there's discussion going on, there's like. Everybody.
Other than how many of you pointing to us, are like subdued. It's harder to feel like. They were pointing to the. Everywhere, like restaurants, the cafe, everything is like, yeah. About 7.
We make where the.
Yeah, it's that one building, this is so far.
Selection or just.
Yeah,
I can,
yeah.
the other way around.
Wow. So it's more of the big one.
I don't know, that I was thinking about.
I mean, technically you can do that. You have the page, then you have like your hash, and then the part of the page, right?
Get that?
So you could have to.
For sure.
Just on the fun level, it's how to do the practice with the people started.
Yeah, it seems.
It's a very, it's very, very much.
Yeah, exactly. And big enough to go to site.
Yes, I think we wish we had a bit more time.
This, we need this, we can play on this and street.
And I don't.
If the rest of the general way of doing that is very useful.
Yeah, and it's one of those. It has.
Yeah, basically.
One of the reasons.
I do have the turnover.
What's my identity?
And you just call this, then you can solve it. Yeah.
Or if somebody uses
I mean, this, I mean, I do mention it. Yeah.
Yeah.
somebody G bit.
All right. Are you part of the?
Yeah, exactly.
So.
Of course, they.
Yeah.
We get really excited about it. I think I like it.
It's like a little bit. It's fair out, like it's just the same kind of thing.
Yeah, so.
I mean, I feel everybody those.
One political proposals. And they already do it at school.
I think that
Unique thing.
Ladder in. So the picture, I mean, the picture of somebody on a ladder in the middle.
Yeah, it's the big sale of actually that's like. All the people who put on here. So, but yeah, that project is sort of to have a states. Then it's like.
Yeah.
Yeah. You need something that. Yeah.
Which lost. Okay, so what do we have here?
Produced by Gothenburg. Looking at the right in space. And researcher.
Yeah, I mean.
Data, they're really well.
Okay. It's really.
Also the area. Yes, come back with so it's good.
You have to just right now.
It can be a part of the.
Then part of the visa. But then it's still.
Sense. And then was some glue for the researcher on that. And the product.
But I mean, we found that early on.
The oil. I don't know.
I suppose that's usually actually what launch. Could be.
More or less pressure.
With the. Mint is a strategy.
That's a good point.
The only one who had salad seeds.
Yeah.
Euroscience gateway. So this is the the galaxy.
Yes.
This is made in by research banding. Which is exactly who is.
You understand it, yeah, exactly.
I heard.
Yeah.
Just a matter of some.
Kind of just.
I can buy a thing and try to.
The thing I sort of had in the release where they slapped a title on it, having been made that very clear in the body of this, that actually. For some reason they decided not. I mean, it's probably a bit late, but so much.
For journalists, you have one.
Yeah, that was the Bible.
Not right now.
Yeah.
Like the process, but this is more. Policy. I mean, mainly, you're already on it. Number of strings.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. And.
So there will be one. But there's a bit of a legacy. No, but that's it for my. So it's probably one part is one. There's that it's in mandatory shows that it's strong encouragement to share.
Really? What I know it is. Might not be. I agree.
Being able to understand.
I don't know. I don't actually.
Yes, I mean, like,
Oh, yeah, so that's the other part, like, we only have 11 jobs.
yeah, very good.
They're already compliant, so they're not gonna be.
Yeah.
So they're not gonna be knocked back to it, so basically. The last one.
Yes.
For a sediment.
Yeah.
One of them every single.
Yeah, and some that wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so in reality.
Yeah.
Okay. It's also fast. I think we need to.
Yeah, no, you have to definitely. I just found it.
Yeah, I mean.
Like our original.
It's just like.
Yes.
Yes, yeah, you're leaving for that.
Yeah, I think it's about.
Yeah.
Like, they have to. people to start by.
Good.
by-
Probably up.
I mean,
most of
kind
them.
of like.
Yeah, they're like a man.
Then they were the guy. Which would you?
Because like, for example, you
In
might say,
a way.
Yeah, between you and yeah, exactly. It was very.
but that.
But no, it was good.
Yeah.
I haven't actually worked out.
So that's probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, let's say that.
We don't.
So
Yeah.
Like, I know that.
You know,
Yeah, this. So you going anywhere else?
without timing.
Probably gonna.
Yeah, actually. Right, it's extracting questions. Yeah, you know, but I mean, so with the that right, so you have to pay attention. And yeah,
They are.
that they use that. Ah, and stuff. I mean, if you pay large. No, I'm playing also for
That stuff is all around.
which goes the other way. That's actually, I would say that's actually, let's say that it is. Which means, yeah, we can. Probably. Have a large enough collection, then you get. Yeah. I mean, my name is.
I know, exactly.
More people with size. Yeah, right up in stuff.
If they're still number.
So I'm going to give a 2-minute warning to the people online. We'll probably be wrapping up in just a minute and moving on to the discussion and wrap up.
Yeah, I know that.
That works. I think that we're going to pump this up. And then we would publish this in that way. And yeah, they basically. We could just. But that's like you know,
Yes, but that, I think there was a question for definition around what that way, which. It's something else. We're not doing that. We could go like
yeah. So yeah, so it seems.
Yeah.
I think
Really different.
Yeah, like if you think of these. Project. It wasn't that.
Which is fine. It's just
ja, genau, aber das ist ja
I think Chris in my team was actually out of the solid. Yeah, he might carry on being engaged to that for, I don't know, it seems. Yeah, so it was. It's on. I'm trying to get the team.
2 minutes, Katie?
Yeah, and I'd already given people the that warning, so I think we can wrap up whenever you're ready. And I just, Rena, I don't know if you can see the chat, but I just put in a question for you to think about for the discussion.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. There's so many great contributions that I've seen, and you're really pushing this group forward. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, we didn't really, I didn't really have a chance to look at all of them because it's I kind of get stuck at certain things. There was a question for Rena. Maybe we start with that. So the idea is that we have 15 more minutes roughly.
I don't, maybe just say the question, Katie, because I don't really know.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was just, a brand new idea just occurred to me as to whether we wanted to allow and or encourage people to add more ideas to the Jamboard for a period of time because they may not have had a chance to look through everything.
Okay, then we have to send for people online as well.
Yeah,
people online or people in the room if you haven't had a chance to say everything you wanted to say, but it just occurred to me. So
is the link to the Jamboard in our session notes?
It is. Someone put it at the top. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
okay, so so that's definitely something that you can go back and if you mull over something and you want to add something, please go ahead. We're not going to close it straight away.
Or join the group and talk to us. Write an email. There's different ways of doing this.
Okay, so we just have a really couple minutes for discussion. So I don't know if something came up as you were thinking that you want to share online or in the room.
Or that you want to discuss something. Okay,
Yeah,
so here you go.
Yeah, it's sorry.
Yeah. Don't worry, that happens to us when we're having this conversation.
So my question is really, how do you define granularity in terms of can a collection with subsets
does every data element have one granularity? Because there should be combinations, I would say, right?
Right.
So this is the collection with possibility of.
So granularity along these dimensions.
It's still a collection, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there's multiple ways of granularity. So that's what we mean kind of by these dimensions.
Yeah.
As the word, the ways that you can divide, like say, I'm going to use my oceanographic discipline example.
Yeah.
So when we offer data at Ocean Networks Canada for a particular data set, which is say data of a deployment of a particular instrument, we allow subsetting by time. You can take it like if it was deployed for a year, you could take maybe only a month of it. You could also only take one of the variables rather than all the variables that were there. So just different notions of subsetting by which we're using this word dimension. But that's what I think one of the conversations that I had with someone was about, okay, yes, this is a good idea, but how do we do it? And we don't have the answer quite yet. Like we have to still work as a community to figure out what are these particular dimensions in a common language and how do we talk about their resolutions that you can slice and dice within a dimension, and how do you define the endpoints that you have in your data set or collection or subset. So there are still question marks there. So we need to move towards defining these particular options. But does that make sense?
I think so.
And I think it's one of the key questions, how do you slice your data set? Like for example, you do a survey, but you also do a pre-test. So does the information about the pre-test belong with the survey, or should it be its own data set? And let's say you run the same survey twice. Should that information also be in that data set, or should it be its own data set? And then there also be like a collection that includes all these objects. And how are you going to model that? And the more we talk about it amongst ourselves, the more we realize this is our domain specific questions that you cannot just generally answer on the abstraction level that we are using here. So you really have to look at what's going on and try to come up with domain specific solutions there. So you get
No,
it's fine.
No, so but I agree, but you still can probably create some sort of middle layer. So until this point, you can generalize, and here we can really say this part you need to find out in your case anyway.
Yeah,
we can help you with this general part.
And I think dimensions like time might be appropriate for all fields, but they should be possible across a lot of domains, right? So we could probably work towards extracting very common ones. You don't necessarily have to use them in all domains, but that we use the same terminology and ways of describing them when they do apply. So I think that's where we need to go.
For my use case, I would very much like to have a place where I could define my own way of slicing my stuff.
Yeah.
But then I could register that as a formal way in a central registry that takes care of getting to that point. So that we're going from universal place and down to here, and now we go down to stuff that you can have to specify.
Yeah.
But I don't have the possibility of getting an EOI. I don't have money to buy a data set membership or whatever.
Right. So it should be a service from the repositories to allow minting of the DOI to the user. Yeah. Any other points?
I'll just say no questions online at the moment, but do send them through. So go ahead for the room.
Otherwise, we just pick out one of the pursuits randomly and then just discuss that real quick. Maybe you want to do that? I don't know.
Okay, well,
okay.
I'll also say if there are no other questions, I'll just comment from looking at the Jamboard. There seemed to be a lot of good feedback, especially around the policy one and how, as written, it's vague and could be interpreted or read in different ways. And so I think that's an area that we could work on further. So thank you for your feedback on that.
And we are in the actual guidance document expanding on these notions, but just for the sake of the activity, we tried to keep the words short so you're not reading a whole, bunch of paragraphs. But sometimes, they do need that clarity.
Okay, so I'm just reading this. I said, first of all, I said that we should provide examples, and I think that's a very, very good point because these things are very, very abstract, and And yeah, so we'll take that to heart, it's like our homework to do that, and do some compliment on what B and saying, yeah. So thank you for that as well.
Yeah.
So maybe Kate.
And unsurprisingly, most post-its are on the definition. 'Cause
Yeah,
it always
yeah.
happens.
And that has actually been our experience, that the definition of what is even granularity. So what are you guys even?
And what is the data set?
In prior sessions, it has been like 50% of the time and 80% of the discussion. So I'm quite happy that we got to have at least some of the post-its on the recommendation. Oh. So Katie, maybe you wanna read out one of the Jamboard ones? Or show the Jamboard, that might be interesting.
I could. I'm just mindful of the time and to have ability to wrap up. But I think I'll say that one of the things that came through on a couple of them is how some recommendations will be more applicable in some scenarios than others. So some policy recommendations may apply to university policy, but not a funder policy, for example, or someone wrote under the definitions. In the case of dynamic creation of subsets by repository on demand, some recommendations may not be applicable. And so I think that that's sort of a theme for us to think about how to communicate, which relates a bit to the list that Graham had shown on the list of roles.
Yeah.
And how those are in some ways categories of stakeholders that we can be thinking about. The other thing I will say is that what people didn't really have a chance much to wrap their mind around yet was the adoption idea. So we'd love to hear people's thoughts on those after the session.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so obviously our next step is to finish the draft, taking into account a lot of these comments and feedback. Get that published out to the community, and then it's still and also publish those use cases more formally, supplementary materials on our working group webpage. Once we do submit that draft, it goes through a community review process. So we get posted through the RDA community, and there's a month of various feedback that would be collected, and then we have another chance to do some revisions and get that out there, and then take a breath. And then hopefully that gets endorsed by the RDA. And there's, we need to have some people or organizations try to adopt, maybe not in full, but in parts what makes sense. So we'd love to, support those adopters and hear about ways that maybe things are being adopted. And then hopefully if there's even some early adoption on some of these, or working towards adoption, we can maybe do another session at International Data Week to kind of highlight some of these ways that people are trying to put things into practice. Or maybe we've worked towards figuring out what are his dimensions and what is this metadata more precisely, or engaging, say, data site, can you put more structure around how you fill out the time field or something like that, so that, if you're harvesting this metadata, it's more clear or more similar, no matter who's populating that metadata. So those are the kinds of things we might be doing next, but we have to really figure that out, what's needed. Any other final closing comments?
Yeah, so again, thank you very much for attending. Already made it. Yeah, thanks for your help, and see you around.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Katie.
Stopping the recording.
Thanks very much.